now about, one of the principles is the principle of transparency. Principle of transparency, which is relevant in the field of environmental law, but in general it's relevant in the field of administrative law. It's relevant for all the activities which are done by the administration in Guatemala on local level, regional level, on national level, but in a sense also on international level. It's important to realize that this principle of transparency, and this is more in general for all the principles of good governance, there is not a clear line between one and the other principle. Sometimes there is a kind of overlap between one principle and the other principle. I will give you an example. You can say it's a question of due care, which is the principle of carefulness. It is a question of due care that the administration publish some decisions. On the other hand, you can also say it's the question of the principle of transparency, that publication of the decision. So what I want to say is sometimes principles are overlapping, but each of the 6 group have a kind of hardcore and a central element which make it distinguishable from one from the other. Then to transparency. Why it's important to have such a principle of transparency? Now, first of all, it's important that the citizens know what is happening within the administration, that they get the information about activities of the administration. So it's a kind of informing the public. And why it's important before informing the public? Now, that has to do with making the distance smaller between the administration and the citizens. But it is also important for another reason, because when, for instance, the citizens have that information, then based on that information, they can also participate in all kinds of decision-making process. So it's as such it is important, but it's also important in relation to other principles. And when we look to the principle of transparency, how it is, at least in theory, divided, and then we see 3 elements in it. 3 elements of transparency. The first element is transparency in relation to meetings of the government, meetings of several commissions. So that these meetings are open, or at least that there is information about the discussions in the meeting. That is one element of the principle of transparency, that information is relevant for the citizen. The second element of that principle of transparency is the element that decisions or other activities of the administration will be published in the newspaper, or published in the radio and television, or published somewhere else in a way that people can hear it, can read it. So that is the second way. And the third is the question of information, public information, which is at the government. Relevant public information, for instance in the field of environment, which is important for the citizens to know for several reasons, and one of the reasons is for making possible a good participation. Now let's look to the situation in Guatemala on that principle of transparency. Now in general you can say at least looking to the constitution, or looking to some specific legislation, for instance on the protection of areas, you find some regulations on transparency. But it's not so detailed, it's mostly not so specified as it could be. And a good idea, a good example, and you find in my material some examples how it could be done. But a good example is, for instance, the Aarhus Treaty, where there is a very specified regulation on transparency of information. So about the third category. But let me say there is a good starting point, and there is also the main elements are in the Constitution and in the legislation. But the question is, how is it going in practice, of course? That is, it's not only a question of good paper and good legislation, but it's also a functioning of the practice. And then you know it better than me how the practice is in Guatemala. But the first situation is that the people are realizing that there is such a principle of transparency and that there is a right on transparent information. And when we speak about transparency, it does not mean that everything should be published. There are situations in which there are restrictions. You can imagine when there is a kind of public interest, when there is a kind of international relation between countries. So there are situations in which, or when it's pure private information, there are some restrictions. But knowing that there are restrictions, nevertheless, there is, let me say, a right for citizens on this public information. And there is also the responsibility of the administration, of the government, to give that information. And too often we see, and now I'm speaking more about my country perhaps than Guatemala, too often you see that the administration have the way of doing it that to keep it secret. And let me say, to keep information secret when there are not really arguments for it, that makes the distance between citizens and administration bigger instead of smaller, which should be one of the main arguments of that principle of transparency.